The public has to wake up to the fact that most of the cancer, diabetes, and heart disease that we have in our world is being caused by wireless technology, and specifically by your cell phone.
Okay, and that was where I wanted to go next, and the mechanism or how this electrical technology causes these diseases.
Okay. First is the fact that it does. And this was discovered by, as I mentioned him before, Dr. Samuel Millam, retired from the Washington State Department of Health. He wrote his little booklet called Dirty Electricity back in 2011. And these amazing charts were in his book from the 1930s and 1940s when President Roosevelt's rural electrification program was going on. So there were charts from 1930, there were charts from 1940, that as soon as a state was electrified, the rates of rural cancer, diabetes, and heart disease quintupled. All of a sudden, the areas that had been electrified had 5 times as much of these diseases as areas that were not electrified. This was shocking, and also people didn't want to hear it. I took his work back to about the year 1800, and I found not only that what he said was true, but it has been true for a long, long time. That before we encircled the Earth with millions of miles of telegraph wires, there was basically no such thing as diabetes. It was an extremely rare disease. If you were a doctor, you were lucky if you saw 2 cases in your whole lifetime. Even doctors who wrote books about it didn't see more than 2 cases in their lifetime, 1 or 2 cases. Cancer was a very uncommon disease. Heart disease did not exist except in old people and in infants because of congenital disorders. This was true up till about the 1850s. In the 1850s and 1860s, all of a sudden, wherever electricity came, you started to see a rise in these 3 diseases specifically. And this has continued up to today, and I've correlated it with each advance in electrical technology. And the explanation has to do with what goes on in our cells, and in fact in the powerhouses in our cells where we metabolize our food. That's called the mitochondria. The last step in metabolism is the electron transport system in the mitochondria, where the electrons from our food get combined with the oxygen that we breathe, and we essentially burn our food and produce energy. Electron transport is subject to interference by electromagnetic fields.
Which sounds very obvious.
Yeah. And what happens when you interfere with electron transport? You can no longer efficiently metabolize sugars, so they back up into your bloodstream, and you get diabetes. What happens when you can no longer efficiently metabolize fats? That backs up into your bloodstream, fats get deposited into arteries, and you get heart disease. The flip side of it is you're not making good use of the oxygen that you breathe. So all your cells are, to some degree, oxygen starved. And cancer thrives in an anaerobic environment, anaerobic metabolism. In fact, how cancer is usually diagnosed nowadays is because cancer cells use enormous amounts of glucose in anaerobic glycolysis. That's how cancer is diagnosed. You take a picture of the body, and the areas that show up as having high radio-labeled glucose are the areas where you look for cancer. So those 3 diseases are going to be increased if you interfere with electron transport, and that's exactly what's happening.
And reading your book, everything you present makes a very, very convincing argument for this.
And I didn't make this up. I'm very good at piecing together pieces of a puzzle. I'm very good at seeing the overall picture. All my sources for historical are original sources. All my sources for the science, and I didn't invent all this either. There's Dr. Martin Blank and Reba Goodman at Columbia University, until they retired, were talking about the interference of electron transport by electromagnetic fields. And there are others. Everything in my book is documented in detail in the bibliography. The bibliography is almost 140 pages long, because I knew that everything that I'm saying was going to be controversial and it needed to be thoroughly documented, and it is.
So maybe we could get into some of the studies of the effects on animals and insects, birds, and bee colony collapse is a huge issue these days.
Yeah, the bees is one of the most interesting parts of this. There is a lot of evidence nowadays that colony collapse syndrome in honeybees is due to electromagnetic pollution, largely from cell towers. And there is anecdotal evidence all over the world that bees tend to disappear in the vicinity of cell towers. There's been work explaining this, but let me go back again to the history, that the first instance of reporting of something like this occurred on the Isle of Wight,
yes,
off of England, where Marconi built his first radio station. And immediately, back in 1904, the bees started to disappear from that island, and it was called Isle of Wight disease. And I go into the history of that also, because colony collapse disorder did not emerge from nothing. It had a whole history going back to 1904, except it's gotten a lot worse, and dramatically so in modern times, again, coinciding with cell phone technology. The most dramatic experiment was done, I believe, in Switzerland by Daniel Favre. I may be getting him mixed up with somebody else, but there was a dramatic experiment where they exposed honeybees to an actual cell phone, and then at short intervals took samples of the bees' hemolymph, which is the bees' version of blood. And within 10 minutes after the exposure to a cell phone, the bees were practically not metabolizing their food, that the sugar levels rose to very high levels in their blood, the fat levels rose to very high levels in their blood, the protein levels, the amino acid levels rose to very high levels in their blood. They ceased metabolism, and all it took was 10 minutes to a bee. And their metabolism is very, very much faster than ours is, so it shows up first. But it's spectacular. You asked about birds. There have been surveys of birds. I highlight Alfonso Belmori's studies in Chapter 16, because he specifically took surveys of all the different birds in Valladolid, Spain, where he lives and works. He's a wildlife biologist. And he showed how all the different species were very much more common in areas where there were no cell towers. And they became less and less common the closer you got to cell towers. And he observed their behavior and described their behavior. He observed storks and sparrows. He did experiments with amphibians, raising them in tanks, shielded and non-shielded. Also very dramatic. The shielded tanks of tadpoles that he raised. They were both on a balcony of a building, like the fourth story of a building that was 200 meters away from a cell tower. The shielded tadpoles all lived. The unshielded tadpoles practically all died. It was very dramatic. And so it makes you ask the question, why are so many species of amphibians disappearing from remote wilderness? It probably has very much to do with we don't treat radio stations and radar and cell towers, which we put in remote wilderness, as environmental assaults, and they are.
And they affect plants as well. There's studies of how forests were affected by radar stations.
Especially in the Cold War. Yeah, this was documented in Germany, near the border between East and West Germany, where there was lots of radar aimed at that border, and they had the term Waldsterben, forest death, and it specifically happened in areas that were highly irradiated.
So there's an interesting paradox of the people who are most affected by this technology, whose health is affected the most. You'd think it was the young and the infirm who would be most affected, but studies show that it was actually the healthiest members of the population and the people in the age between 15 and 30 who were most susceptible to particularly the influenza outbreaks.
Yeah, this was a peculiar aspect of influenza, and still is a peculiar aspect of influenza, although nowadays we hear advertisements telling old people and infants to get vaccinated. But in fact, influenza more often makes you sick if you are between the ages of 20 and about 50. And the stronger you are and the healthier you are, the more likely you are to get influenza. And this was very dramatic in the 1918 flu epidemic, so much so that doctors started to worry that their advice to their patients to stay healthy and to be fit and strong was actually killing them because it was the strongest, healthiest people that were getting influenza and dying of it.
Is there any logic to why that happens that way?
Well, they never figured it out. And people who have specialized in influenza since then have not figured out why. My theory is that it is the strongest and healthiest, and it hit pregnant women very hard, too. Those of us who are most vital, in other words, people in their young years, people who get pregnant, people who are very much connected to the world, are also very much more connected to our electrical environment. We have much more qi flowing through us, our acupuncture meridians. And this is vitality that we get from the world. When the global electrical circuit becomes polluted, essentially with dirty electricity, just like when we plug our electronic devices and computers into the wall, we pollute our wiring with dirty electricity. We're actually polluting our bodies with dirty electricity when we throw this stuff out into the world. And those of us who are most connected to our environment are most susceptible to being disturbed by it.
Mm-hmm. And then there's the people that are saying, well, we're living longer than ever before. So what's all this uproar about illness and disease?
I also have a chapter about that. Chapter 14 in the Invisible Rainbow is about exactly that our metabolism is being disturbed. And when you slow down your metabolism, it's like putting us into a mild state of suspended animation. And of course, if your metabolism slows down, you're going to live longer. And it's very interesting. The most reliable way to extend an animal's life in the laboratory is to restrict its intake of food. This is called, in longevity research, calorie restriction. That if you restrict an animal's intake of food throughout its life, it will live longer, and it will live much longer. You can double a mouse's life simply by cutting its food intake in half throughout its life. It slows down its metabolism. But that's a healthy way of slowing down the metabolism. When you cut down your intake of food, your rate of metabolism decreases, your rate of disease also decreases. It turns out that when you irradiate an animal, and this can be non-ionizing radiation, the experiments bear this out too. We have research that they expose rats to radio waves throughout their life. And we have research where they expose animals, various types of animals, to ionizing radiation, atomic radiation, X-rays, gamma rays, for their whole lives. That if the dose is small enough, it won't kill them, but it will make them sick, but they'll live longer. That animals that are exposed to gamma rays at low doses get lots of cancers, but on average they live longer than the unexposed animals. And the same thing with radio waves, that if you expose animals to radio waves throughout their lives, like laboratory rats, they get more cancers, but on average they live longer.
So if they're not killed, if they don't die
of their disease, they live longer.
Uh-huh.
So you can restrict your metabolism in one way and have you become healthier, or you can restrict your metabolism in another way and live a sicker, longer life, and that's exactly what we're doing now. In our world in the 21st century, we are living sicker, longer lives, and the length of our lives is not primarily, is to some extent, but it's not entirely due to modern medicine. Some of it is due to all this electrosmog that we're living in.